Hi there, BookTube. Well, in my Victober announcement video, I promised a video about queer Victorian poets and poetry, and so here it is. Now, it's a really interesting topic because obviously it was very difficult for Victorians who were LGBTQIA whatever, to be in any way open about their sexuality and gender identity and so on, because it was essentially criminal at that point. Certainly, gay male relationships, were seen as a criminal act. Any expression of trans identity would have been. With women, is a little bit more complicated, and it wasn't technically criminal. The story, probably apocryphal, is that Queen Victoria refused to believe the possibility of sexual relationship between women, so it didn't end up on the law books. A little bit dubious about that, but it certainly was quite an accepted thing for two women to live together and be like, close friends. So it was perhaps easier for sort of lesbian women writers to kind of pass under the radar a bit, I guess. But again, if they were known to have a sexual relationship, that was certainly something that would, cause furore. So inevitably, when we talk about this subject, there is an element of sort of guesswork and assumptions going on. Okay, let's take the example of Edward Lear. Okay, now for all these poets, I will give their dates just so you get an idea of where they fit in the sort of Victorian range, as it were. So Lear was born 1812 and died in 1888, so earlier end. Now, Lear never married. He said he didn't want to. We've got no indication that he ever had any kind of relationship with a woman. We know he had a wonderful affinity with children, but there's not the slightest hint of a sort of sexual element in that. We do know that he spent the last 30 years of his life living with his Albanian manservant, sort of just served them basically. But again, there is actually no indication whatsoever that was, a love affair or a sexual relationship. Maybe today, if Edward Lear were alive, he'd be happily sort of identifying as ace. Who knows? We can only guess. Having said that, there are poets where we've got a fair old idea, and I think if you ask most people to name a queer Victorian poet, the one that would sort of trip out of people's lips would be Oscar Wilde, of course. Oh, dates, 1854 to 1900. Now, interestingly, Wilde's sort of sexuality doesn't come through that strongly in his writing, certainly not in an explicit way. I mean, particularly not in his poetry. I mean, the Dorian Gray, picture of Dorian Gray, his novel, it's very definitely there. You don't get a lot of it in his plays, and as I say, not really in his poetry. Perhaps the clearest, I suppose, sense of his sort of queer identity in a poem would be in Apologia, which was published in 1895. Now, I should have said at the beginning, I will say now, that all the individual poems that I mention in this video, I will try and leave a link to them below so that you can go and read them if you're interested. Now, the most actually kind of out there gay poet of Victorian times, I would say, was Algernon Charles Swinburne, dates again, 1837 to 1909, who was, I don't know, as notorious, I suppose, for his sex life as Wilde, but much more kind of, never got himself into quite such a legal pickle. perhaps because Swinburne was cushioned by the fact that he was well off. You know, he came from a well off background. His father was an admiral. He went to Eton and to Oxford. He's a brilliantly lyrical poet. Sometimes his poetry is criticised, for being more beautiful than it is emotional. Emotionally sort of real. I don't know. It's stylistically fine, very fine poetry. And when his first collection came out in 1866, Poems and Ballads, it was instantly enormously admired, but also caused a degree of outrage because there are very kind of distinct sexual themes and imagery and ideas and overtones and undertones in the collection. If you want an example to have a look at, you could read Sapphics, which, as the name implies, is specifically a poem about lesbian love, and he also writes some of the poems that kind of explore, I don't know, honestly but slightly disturbingly, that kind of interrelationship between sort of sex and pain and love and pleasure, and Swinburne appears to have been really into S&M himself, and that kind of feeds into the poetry. He was relatively outrageous in his personal life. The most famous story to that effect was he was friends with the pre-Raphaelites. That kind of fitted with his sort of being part of the sort of aesthetic movement, really interested in sort of, I don't know, almost a worship of beauty in the world rather than conventional religion, But one stage he and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the painter, were living together, were sharing lodgings. And Rossetti supposedly had to, go out and read the riot act to Swinburne for making such a racket, sliding naked down the banisters with his boyfriend, that poor old Rossetti just couldn't concentrate on his painting. Maybe slightly made up. Wilde accused Swinburne of exaggerating his sort of social and sexual non-conformity, but then that they were friends, and that may have been Wilde in part trying to protect his friend. I don't know. Swinburne, part of his sort of social rebellion or rebelliousness was he was a very heavy drinker, and in the end he was more or less killing himself with the effects of alcohol. Particularly risky because he seems to also have been epileptic. So he got taken in hand by a friend and legal advisor who dried him out and kept him on the straight and narrow for the rest of his life. And there's a school of thought that says his poetry became more dull after that. I don't know if that's really fair. Swinburne's complete opposite, I suppose, in terms of, I don't know, uprightness and sort of earnest decency and concern for the rest of the world, is Amy Levy, who's the first woman poet I'm going to talk about, and her dates 1861 to 1889. What a remarkable woman! The fact that she was, let's say, a bit more straight-laced in her sort of her values, it doesn't mean she wasn't a fascinating person. She was an essayist, she was a novelist, she was a poet. Very bright child. She wrote a kind of criticism of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh when she was 13. She had her first poem published when she was 14. She was the second ever Jewish woman to go to Cambridge University to study. Yeah, she was a feminist, a real progressive thinker, a friend of Eleanor Marc's. There's so much you could say about her. When she was 25, she met and fell wildly in love with Violet Paget, who's better known under her pseudonym Vernon Lee. And couple of poems of hers to kind of look at, I suppose. One would be To Vernon Lear, a love poem to her, and New Love, New Life. You know, she absolutely expresses her you know, queer love in her poetry. Sadly, she also was, you know, really troubled by bouts of depression, and she actually took her own life at the age of 28. What a shame, because there might have been so many more poems and novels and interesting things to come from Amy Levy. So now let's talk about some Victorian queer poets who had, you know, lived happily ever after instead, yeah, and had happy long-term relationships. The first couple I'm going to talk about are Marc-André Rafalovich and John Gray. Give you their dates again. 1864 to 1934 and 1866 to 1934. Now, Raffalovich is sometimes described as a French poet because he was born in France, but he came to England when he was 18 to go to university and never stayed here thereafter and wrote in English, so I think we can count him as a Victorian poet. He was actually introduced to John Gray through their mutual friend, Oscar Wilde. I say mutual friend, but in Gray's case, that was like, you know, former lover. There is a theory that John Gray was one of the models for Dorian Gray in the picture of Dorian Gray. I mean, I think that character was an amalgamation of people, but he was one of the inspirations for it. They ran a literary salon together in London. Gray is an interesting character because he was came from a working class background and educated himself at evening classes, learnt languages, and he's actually best known for his translations of other poets, you know, like Rimbaud or Baudelaire. But he did write poetry himself, and one you might look at would be Summer Past, which was dedicated to Wilde, in fact. Rafalovich wrote in an 1895 poem that's well worth a look, called Love, Crime, Vice and Sin, and it's specifically a poem about falling in love with a man and expressing that is true love and not a crime or a sin. And the fact that he wrote and published that in 1895, you know, is perhaps not unrelated to the fact that was the year Wilde was prosecuted and imprisoned. Rafalovich and Gray remained a couple for the rest of their lives. You know, that they converted to Catholicism together. Gray actually became a Catholic priest, but you know, they were still very much a couple, and they actually died within months of each other. You know, I think the one's death precipitated the death of the other, as you can see from the fact that both died in 1934. Now, a female Victorian couple who were equally devoted and equally interesting are Catherine Harris Bradley, 1846 to 1914, and Edith Emma Cooper, 1862 to 1913. Now, you will not find either of them in a sort of named as authors in an anthology of Victorian poetry because they wrote together under the pseudonym Michael Field. Deliberate choice to allow them to write sort of poetry without having to you know, reveal their sexuality and their relationship, although it was very well known to their friends who used to call them the Fields or the Michaels. And in fact, their friend Browning kind of gave the game away when he wrote admiringly about some of their work when together when it was published, and kind of, you know, intimated their real identities. But they wrote plays together, they wrote poetry. I mean, you know, they wrote a lot. But perhaps most interesting for us is, you know, their gorgeous kind of love poetry. You might want to try Power in Silence beautiful poem. They decided, interestingly, they were actually an aunt and a niece, and that's how they knew each other. But then that developed into a passionate and very close relationship. In the 1870s, they started living together. They lived together for 40 years, and as I say, were very much sort of known and understood to be a couple by their friends, if not sort of publicly. And friends that included Oscar Wilde again, in fact. Another friend of the Fields, or Bradley and Cooper, was the bisexual writer John Addington Symonds. Dates again, 1840 to 1893. Now, Symonds is predominantly known as a writer of prose. He was a kind of cultural historian. He wrote about the Renaissance. He wrote lives of people like Shelley, for example. He also wrote prose in defence of or about what he described as Greek love. But that was not for public publication, that was for private circulation. He, at the same time, he had, well-known, that we know of, gay relationships, but he also married and had 4 children. And in fact, Edward Lear wrote The Owl and the Pussycat for his eldest daughter Janet when she was 3, which is a lovely interconnection, isn't it? But his poetry has some of the sort of earliest really direct references to male sexual love in English literature. Back in the 1870s, he wrote about David and Jonathan in a way that, really specifically talks about them, kissing and so on. He also, there's a lot about, I don't know, his own kind of loves and affections, and he can write so quite beautifully about that, although he's not sort of extremely well known as a poet. The one that I will put a link to is Clifton and a Lad's Love, which it's a bit long, but it has some gorgeous stanzas in it, I would say. Now, we've talked about how Wilde and Swinburne and Gray and Raffalovich and the Fields and Symonds and so on, all had sort of friendships, mutual connections, sort of were like overlapping literary circles, shall we say. And Lear too, in fact. A poet that kept himself a bit apart from that, I suppose, was Alfred Housman, 1859 to 1936, usually referred to as A.E. Housman. He was a well-known classicist and a well-recognised poet. Shropshire Lad is his sort of best-known collection. But he was very private about his sexuality. In fact, he lived more or less as a recluse. But he expresses it quite clearly in his poetry, I would say. I mean, Shropshire Lad, 1890s, is full of references to young men and sort of unrequited love and the sort of transience of youth and beauty, and it's really clearly there. And we know that when he was a student, he fell in love with a fellow student, Moses Jackson, and tragically for him, that passionate love was unreciprocated. I'm going to specifically draw your attention to a poem that Housman wrote in 1895, but which wasn't published until 1937, after his death in 1936, when his brother Lawrence then chose to publish this poem. The date 1895 is relevant when he wrote it, because the year, as you know, of Oscar Wilde's trial and imprisonment. And this poem, which is called "Oh, Who Is That Young Sinner?", is specifically about homophobia. He uses the metaphor of hair colour to kind of like point up, draw attention to the ridiculousness, the awfulness of discriminating against someone sort of arbitrarily on the basis of a personal characteristic, whether, you know, that's hair colour or sexuality. It's well worth reading, and if possible I will put the whole text in the description as well as a link to it when I put the links to the others. Now obviously I've just skimmed the surface here of sort of queer Victorian poetry, you know, and there is, you could delve so much further. I will put a link to the Queer Victorian Archive, which is an academic resource if you're interested in looking a bit further. But before I go, as a little coda, as it were, I'm going to mention another woman poet as a kind of honourable mention, because that poet is Charlotte Mew, and she was a Victorian. She was born in 1869. She lived to 1928. She is possibly the finest poet of all those that I've talked about here, in my opinion, but not technically a Victorian poet, because she wrote short fiction, you know, during the reign of Victoria. She didn't really kind of get stuck into writing her very fine poetry until the early 20th century, when she became, you know, much admired by Thomas Hardy and Virginia Woolf and others. And, you know, it's sort of, she's like a link between Victorian age and modernism in poetry. And if you want to just sort of dip into Mew, a lovely short poem by her is Rooms, which again I'll link to below. There we go. That's my little whistle-stop tour through some queer Victorian poets. I would love in the comments to hear about others, about ones that you know and that you like, or things that I've missed out, and do, you know, venture out and have a read of some of these poems.